We are in Genesis, chapter 41, and as I say, we're only going to cover half the chapter today. Quite a lengthy chapter, so we're only going to cover half of it today, and a lot of it is narrative, which is awesome. So let us just briefly recap for those who haven't been here the last few weeks. Basically, what we've been doing is going through the life of Joseph as recorded in the book of Genesis. And basically what we've seen, this man Joseph has been sold into slavery by his brothers. They didn't like him, they betrayed him, sold him into slavery. He ends up in Egypt. And while in Egypt, he is a servant to a man called Potiphar. And he actually finds favor in Potiphar's eyes because Joseph is a good man, he's a trustworthy man. But what happens is Potiphar's wife takes a liking to him and tries to sleep with him. And Joseph says no to Potiphar's wife's advancements, even to the point where he eventually just runs out, he flees, and she accuses him of rape. And basically Potiphar believes the lies, sends Joseph to prison. And then when Joseph is in prison, he then basically interprets the dreams of two of the king's the king's people. So a butler and a baker. And basically how last week ended, or what we looked at last week, we saw Joseph give a plea to the Pharaoh's butler. And if you remember that plea, it was, remember me. That was his plea, remember me. And he said that to Pharaoh's butler. Joseph, through God, had interpreted the dreams of the two fellow prisoners, and those interpretations were true. The butler was restored back to his position with the king. The baker was executed just as Joseph had said. But what had happened is when the butler was restored, he quickly forgot what Joseph had done for him. And that's how we ended last week. In verse 23 of chapter 40, it said this: "Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." And I was thinking about this today. The God of the universe gave this miraculous dream to this butler. Through Joseph, God revealed to the butler the future, what was going to happen. And this is truly a life-changing event, right? How many times do you get a dream from God and then it's interpreted by someone and it's telling you what's going to happen in the future? And yet, how does this butler respond? He forgets. He forgot Joseph. And likewise, I think it's safe to say he forgot what God had done for him. And my encouragement is, on a side note, is that we wouldn't make the same mistake. So often, we can be quick to forget what God has done. And I think that's why, time and time again, throughout the scriptures, God says to his people, remember. As an example, take communion. When we take the bread and the wine, why do we do that? We do that to remember. Do this in remembrance of me. Take the bread and the wine so you don't forget, so that you continue to remember what Jesus has done. The butler forgets Joseph, but it's important to know that God didn't forget Joseph. God saw what was going on. God never forgot. God remembered. He didn't forget. God never took his eye off of Joseph, not for a second. In prison, God was with Joseph. God did not forget him. God had a plan. And what we see throughout the account of Joseph, as we see him go through such difficulty, we see that God is both with him and God is both at work and using it for a purpose. And this purpose Joseph is going to have to wait until he sees what that is. Verse 1 of our text, so Genesis chapter 41, verse 1 says this, "And it came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he stood by the river." 2 whole years from the point that Joseph had interpreted the butler and baker's dream until this point now, 2 years had passed. And nothing major had really changed. We sometimes forget that these are real people. And imagine continuing to remain in prison for a crime you didn't commit, not knowing when or if you would be set free. Months go by, years go by, no sign of change. And in those moments, we need to remember that God was with him in the in-between. And God likewise is with us in those moments of what we maybe call the in-between. Those moments when we are waiting on the Lord to act perhaps in a certain way, to intervene and to change the situation. Or perhaps ultimately our whole lives as believers is ultimately lived in the in-between, because we have this promise that God is coming back for us. Jesus is coming again. We have this promise that if we pass away, we will go to be with him, but we're living life in the in-between of that ultimate promise. And what I find amazing about Joseph and in this life that he lives, and obviously if you know the story, there is going to be this radical change, this radical reversal of his situations. But what I love about Joseph is even in the in-between, even in the moments of difficulty, he continues to walk with God. And then, when the time was right, God stepped in. And God steps in a way no one could have seen coming. And it all begins with this one night when Pharaoh has this unsettling dream. And in essence, chapter 41 really is this pivotal turning point, of which we'll get to see part of today. So this is the unsettling dream that Pharaoh had. Verse 2, "Suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them out of the river, ugly and gaunt, and stood by the other cows on the bank of the river. And the ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. So Pharaoh awoke." So here's Pharaoh, king of Egypt. He goes to sleep one night just like any other night, but he in essence has this startling dream about cannibal cows. So first of all, we read that there are 7 fine-looking cows. I don't think I've ever really thought of a cow as being fine-looking, but that's how it's described here. This fine-looking cow, and fine-looking for a cow means you're fat and you're plump and you're healthy, and they are well fed, these fine-looking cows, and they are enjoying life. But then comes along 7 ugly and starving cows. They are gaunt. And in the dream, he has the 7 ugly cows turn round and they eat the 7 healthy cows, which must have been, let's be honest, a pretty gruesome sight. And naturally, Pharaoh suddenly awakes up. And he must be wondering, if you've ever had a strange dream, like, what on earth is going on? What does that mean? And maybe you've been there, you've had a weird dream, you wake up, you're like, whoa, that was strange. And then what do? Generally, you try and go back to sleep, which is what he does. But then he has a second dream. Verse 5, he slept and dreamed a second time. And suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then, behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them, and the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. So the second dream is very similar to the first. Only this time, instead of cows, it's the heads of grain. So, like the top bit of a piece of grain. And basically the 7 heads and 7 unhealthy heads, and the bad heads eat the good heads. So those are the 2 dreams that he has. And it leaves Pharaoh in a state where his very spirit is troubled. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled. And he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. And Pharaoh told them his dream, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. What we see here in these verses, as I say, Pharaoh, he's troubled by this dream, so he seeks out all his magicians, his advisors across Egypt. He tells them the dreams, but they can't interpret the dreams. And what I want us to see here is that God, in his grace, is exposing the insufficiency of Egypt's false gods. I want you to think about it for a second. Here is the king of Egypt, one of the most powerful men in the world at the time, with this powerful force and Egyptian nation. And he himself, as Pharaoh, is kind of set up as a godlike figure in the Egyptian belief. And yet, here, he finds himself in a position where before him, there is something for which he doesn't understand. There's something in front of him that he doesn't know. So he seeks his seers, he seeks the wise men, but they too are none the wiser. He is not sufficient. The multiple Egyptian gods don't seem to be sufficient. They're not giving him an answer. And it is the grace of God when we are brought to the place when we realize we are not enough and our false gods are not enough. It is God's grace when he brings us to that place where we realize we need the help of the true living God. We need him to reveal to us the truth about ourselves, the truth about life, the truth about God. And so here we have this king searching for someone to interpret his dream. And while this is taking place, next to him is a certain cupbearer. Next to him is a certain butler who 2 years ago found himself in the same situation of having a dream he didn't understand. You see, just at the right time, that which this butler had forgotten for 2 years, he suddenly remembers. Verse 9, then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh saying, I remember my faults this day. Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker. We each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man with us there, a servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him, speaking of the baker. You see, the butler remembers, and he tells Pharaoh what Joseph did. And I wonder what was going through Pharaoh's mind. I wonder, was he skeptical? Was he thinking, hey, what could a Hebrew slave, a prisoner, do for me, the king of Egypt? I wonder, maybe, did that cross his mind? But the truth is, there was no denying the testimony of the butler. And so, Joseph is summoned. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of the dungeon. And he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. When Joseph woke up that morning, I imagine the last thing he would have expected was an audience with the king of Egypt. He most likely thought it was just going to be another day. He started it as he usually did, perhaps doing the rounds, checking in on the other inmates and his responsibilities, and then he gets the call, hey, Joseph, the king wants to see you. So you're going to need to clean yourself up, have a shave, here are some new clothes. And I think, just need to remember for a second, this is radical. I mean, this doesn't happen every day. An audience with the king. We, in this country, have our own monarch. We have the Queen. And it is not very often that people get a call to come and visit the Queen. And here, with Joseph, we have this humble slave, an imprisoned man, and now we watch him stand before a king. And a king, one of the most powerful men on earth. And what an incredible sight this must have been. This complete contrast between this humble slave and this exalted king. And yet, it is the king that is in need of help. It is the king on his throne who is needing help from the humble servant, the humble slave. And so Pharaoh says to Joseph, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it. But I have heard it said that you can understand a dream to interpret it. And so Joseph answered Pharaoh, saying, it is not me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. Joseph did not claim to be an interpreter of dreams, but rather he claimed to know the one who did, God. Joseph knew God, the God who, as you'll see, sent the dreams, the God who knew exactly what the dreams meant, the God who was willing to work through Joseph. In essence, what Joseph is saying here, he's saying, hey, it's not me, it's God. When Pharaoh says, hey, look, I need you to interpret my dream, and Joseph's humble response is, okay, Pharaoh, look, it's not me, it's God. God will give you the answer. And to be honest, we see this kind of humble mindset of God's people throughout the scriptures. When men and women of God realize that it is God working through them that enables them to do what they cannot do on their own. Take, for example, in the book of Acts, chapter 3, with Peter and John, and when they heal the man, and their response is this, men of Israel, why do you marvel at this? Basically, in that situation with Peter and John, everybody's marveling at what they've done. And they turn around and say, hey, why are you marveling at this? And continue, or why look so intently at us as though by our own power or godliness we made this man walk? In essence, Peter turns around and says, hey, don't marvel. Why are you looking at us as if we did this? Do you not realize it's not through our own power or godliness that we made this man walk, but rather it is through God working through us? And another passage is this, the Apostle Paul, a man who did great things. And he would say these words in 2 Corinthians in chapter 3, verse 4. And we have such trust through Christ toward God. Not that we are sufficient of ourselves to think of anything as being from ourselves, but our sufficiency is from God. What a humbling statement. In essence, what Paul says is, hey, I don't pretend to think that I'm sufficient in and of myself, but rather I've come to know and believe that sufficiency is from God. And that, I think that is actually encouraging word, because how many times, I don't know about you, but there are many times where I do not feel sufficient. And passages that remind me that it's true, I'm not sufficient, but Jesus is. Jesus is sufficient. And it's through Jesus working in me, it's Jesus working through me and through you and through us. He is able to do through us what we could not do on our own. And in the case of Joseph, it was interpreting these dreams. And so, with that laid down, with the groundwork of Joseph saying, hey, it's not me, it's God, Pharaoh then explains the dream to him. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream I stood on the bank of the river. Suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, poor and very ugly and gaunt. Such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. These were really ugly cows, and Pharaoh is making this very clear. He's like, man, I've never seen such ugly cows. And the gaunt and ugly cows ate up the first 7, the fat cows. When they had eaten them up, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. So I awoke. Also I saw in my dream, and suddenly 7 heads came up on one stalk, full and good. Then behold, 7 heads withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. There was no one who could explain it to me. I've tried to understand, Pharaoh says. I've tried. And I've asked my advisors and I've asked my wise men, but nothing. All of my power, all of my influence, but nothing. I still don't understand. I need the help of someone greater. Someone who understands that which I do not understand. This is where God steps in. Then Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. An incredible statement. And I just want to briefly unpack those few words. God has shown Pharaoh what he's about to do. Firstly, I want us to see this. This statement is incredible because firstly, God has shown. The God of the Bible is a God of revelation. He is a revealing God. He is a God who has not chosen to remain silent, but rather he is a God who has chosen to make himself known. And this really is the only way we are able to know him, because, think about it, because God is so far above us, far greater than even our minds can imagine. Because the gap between us and him the chasm is so wide, the only way that we can know him is if he reveals it to us, if he reveals himself, which he has done. God has revealed himself, and one of the most clear ways he has done that is through Jesus. Look at this, what John, the disciple of Jesus, says in his first letter. So 1 John chapter 1. He says this, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, which our hands have handled concerning the word of life. The life was manifested. The life was revealed. And we have seen and bear witness and declare to you that eternal life which was with the Father and was manifested to us. That which we have seen and heard, we declare to you, that you also may have fellowship with us. And truly our fellowship is with the Father and with his Son Jesus Christ. And these things we write to you, that your joy may be full. The disciple of Jesus is using the language of revelation and revealing and manifesting. He's like, hey, we've seen Jesus. Jesus has been revealed. He has been manifested. we have seen, we have touched, we have handled God. As we go through the Bible speaks of a God who reveals himself, a God who has chosen to make himself known. And this is reminded to us even here when it says that God has shown, God has revealed to Pharaoh. And that's the second marvel of this text, is that God would show Pharaoh. The fact that God has chosen to reveal himself and his plan to Pharaoh is incredible. This was a man who did not believe in God. This was a man who worshipped multiple false gods of the Egyptians. This was a man who saw himself as powerful and godlike. And yet, God in his grace reveals himself and his plan, which we'll read about in a second, to Pharaoh. Pharaoh had done nothing to warrant this. Such is the grace of God. And thirdly, I want us to see that God reveals what he's about to do. God is in control. God knows the future. God has a plan, and he's going to bring it about. And what is this plan? Well, the dream reveals it, as Joseph now explains. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. The 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and 7 empty heads blinded by the east wind are 7 years of famine. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt. But after them, 7 years of famine will arise, and all the plenty will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. Basically, 7 years of plenty, 7 years of famine. This is what the dream means. This is a warning to Pharaoh and his people that there's going to be 7 years where there is plenty, where there is abundance. But then that is going to be followed by 7 years of severe famine. And the two dreams are communicating the same truth. And why 2 dreams? Well, Joseph explains, and the dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. God has established. God will shortly bring to pass. Joseph highlights God all over this passage. Pharaoh, you have wrongly seen yourself as God. There is a true God. There is a God who communicates with people. There is a God who holds and controls the future. And there is a God who saves. Now therefore, Joseph continuing speaking to Pharaoh. Now therefore, let Pharaoh set a discerning and a wise man and set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this, and let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5 of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. And let them gather all food of those good years that are coming, and store up grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land for 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, that the land may not perish during the famine. Through Joseph, God delivers his warning. And through Joseph, God delivers a plan for salvation. God has revealed in order to save. Now, have you ever done a jigsaw puzzle? Perhaps you have done. Lois and her housemate at the moment are doing a couple of jigsaw puzzles. So I want you to keep that in mind for a second. I want you to picture a jigsaw puzzle. You have all these separate pieces, and they're all disconnected. And at times, if it wasn't for the picture on the cover, you would really struggle to understand what it all means and how all the pieces fit together to create a beautiful image. And in essence, what we have seen in the story of Joseph is bit by bit, we are watching, and we are still watching, in fact, bit by bit, we are watching the different pieces come together. All these disconnected pieces are now finding their place. We're beginning to see that there is an image being created. And there is someone who has designed this image and planned this image and created this image. And closer, we are moving towards what God was doing through Joseph's pain, suffering, and injustice. We're beginning to see that God was positioning Joseph to fulfill a greater plan and purpose than Joseph could have ever have imagined. This reminds us that God truly knows and holds the future, and as a result, we can walk with Him in the in-between. Today, that is where we are going to leave our text. Joseph has interpreted the dream that, hey, there's going to be 7 years of plenty, 7 years of abundance and plenty, followed by 7 years of famine. He's given the plan for salvation, which is basically this: hey, store. When you have abundance, store food for when the famine comes. Here we have seen how God has used and positioned Joseph into this place to bring about this message, a message of salvation. And next week we get to see how Pharaoh responds. We get to see the other pieces added to the puzzle, because as I said, we don't have the complete image yet. But as you know, when you're doing a puzzle, the closer you get, you kind of then beginning to see the fuller image of what is going to be created. And as we continue on through Joseph's life, we're going to see that to the point that Joseph could get to the end of his life and look back to those who had betrayed him and done wrong to him and say, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. So may this encourage us that we have a God who is with us through the difficulties of life. We have a God who is at work in the midst of those difficulties and has purposes in and through them. And we also have a God who is able to use even that which is done against us for good, as we see with Joseph's life. God knows, God holds the future. And therefore that changes the way I live today. There's an old hymn which goes like this, which some of you may know. It says this: how sweet to hold a newborn baby and feel the pride and the joy that he gives. Oh, but greater still the calm assurance we can face uncertain days because he lives. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future. And life is worth a living just because he lives. And then one day I'll cross that river, I'll fight life's final war with pain. And then as death gives way to victory, I'll see the lights of glory and I'll know he reigns. Because he lives, I can face tomorrow. Because he lives, all fear is gone. Because I know he holds the future. and life is worth a living just because he lives. Joseph reminds us that God holds the future. God holds the future. And because of that, we can live in the day, we can face uncertain days because he lives and because he holds the future. Let us pray together.